Good evening, Chicago and beyond. My name is Tawana Streeter, host of DIY DEI.
And I'm Melissa Donaldson, host of Generation Flex.
We just watched the first installment of CAN TV's new docuseries, The Marginalized Working While Black. And perhaps like me, you're having a fairly strong visceral reaction to the themes and issues amplified in The Marginalized.
And that's absolutely fine and to be expected. There are no easy answers to the issues raised, but if we're going to move forward together, creating safe and brave spaces for the uncomfortable, but critically important conversations like the one we're having tonight is an imperative. We'll introduce the rest of our panelists shortly, but first, let's introduce Dr. Inger Burnett-Ziegler, an associate professor at Northwestern University's Feinberg School of Medicine, to help support our audience and our viewers at home in our collective efforts to process the issues highlighted on The Marginalized. Inger?
I don't know about you all, but I definitely felt something watching The Marginalized just now. And before we get started with our conversation today, why don't we start by just taking a brief pause and doing a collective inhale and exhale together. We as Black people in the workplace take on so much. According to the American Psychological Association, employment is one of the top 10 stressors reported by Americans. But we know that Black people experience more stress related to work than others. People that I work with talk about stress related to being the first, the only, being under a microscope, white privilege, having to provide for their families and their extended families. They talk about stress related to not wanting to let themselves or other people down. This disproportionate burden of stress deeply impacts our mind, our spirit, and our physical body. It can be so impactful that it gets in the way of us being fully productive at work and leading our fullest, most authentic lives. We know that stress in the workplace leads to people not being as productive as they'd like to be, not forming the positive relationships that they'd like to form, isolating themselves. And this can lead to people not, climbing that corporate ladder that they seek to climb. Stress erodes our body. This workplace stress is real, it's palpable. When I was watching The Marginalized just now, I felt something coming up in my body. I felt those reminders of experiences I've had in my own job. And I'm sure many of you can relate to that as well. And so as we unpack this conversation today, I'd like for us to all reflect on what came up for each of us and how we can cope with those feelings that come up and in turn lead ourselves to being our fullest, most authentic selves at work.
Thank you so much, Dr. Burnett-Ziegler. Now it's my pleasure to introduce the other incredible leaders joining Inger on the panel tonight. Chris Powell, CEO of Talmetrics, featured prominently in the Marginalized installment, and also featured prominently in the special report, Yemi Akinsanya, DEI and Culture Officer, Dee Atkins, Chief of Community Engagement and Equity at Thresholds, and the narrative of the marginalized working while Black, Daryl Smith, CEO of Das and Associates.
Absolutely. Welcome, everyone. Ready to dive into this conversation?
Yes. Let's do it.
Okay. Yes. This is for anyone who feels it first. I'm talking about feeling something. So what are your opinions regarding the American caste system as described by Isabel Wilkerson in her book, Caste? What are the different ways that you've seen caste systems play out today? Daryl?
It's a phenomenal question. Prior to her books actually,
Yeah.
she has several, I never thought about leveraging the word caste to describe the conundrum that's happening within the corporate environment. Right? I've spent over 35 years in corporations supporting leaders and organizations lean in and create transformational change around DE&I, but I'd never looked at it through that lens. So now that I look at it through that lens, my aperture has expanded. Because as history, understanding the origin, right, allows one to get to the root. And so the origin of this country has been based on caste. I always thought it was something that happened in India exclusively. Yeah, right? But that's not the case. And so I think it's a way in which to support organizations, again, expand how they are internalizing, approaching, and actioning on opportunities to support that culture, that climate of the organization in more meaningful, transformational type of ways.
It's so great, so great. Are there different kinds of caste systems anyone seeing play out? We know they're happening in the workplace, but are they manifesting in different ways? Yemi?
You know, I have to acknowledge my bias when it comes to caste systems. Having grown up in Lagos, Nigeria, where caste systems was really embedded in the DNA of our culture. So you think about Nigeria being a country of over 200 million people, and we're all, for the vast majority, black. But we have different ethnicities, hundreds of them. However, three ethnicity encompass maybe 75, 80% of all the population. And I happen to be part of that three. I'm Yoruba. And so, and I lived in Lagos, Nigeria, which is predominantly Yorubas. So I came from a caste system where I was in the majority. And I, to be honest, I'm sure my family enjoyed the privilege of being in the majority in that country, right? I'm the same person who has come to the US where the system is quite different. And I'm in the minority. Still a caste system, so to speak, right? So I think when you think about the caste system, when you think about hierarchical structures, when you think about the pyramid system, the food chain system, you know, it's a matter, I think it was well explained in the documentary, it's a matter of when one layer of that caste system shifts, naturally another one has to replace. And I think that's the struggle we see even in the workplace today, where there is a perception of fear, or shall I say, a presence of fear that one community or demographic moving up would naturally bring or create space for another, so to speak. And I think that inherent perception and fear could cause some individuals maybe not to want to participate in the journey of focusing on racial or ethnic type of diversity advancement. And they're rather focused on things that are more around skill sets, qualification, things that feel a little bit more, things that are more supported by the system in which we find ourselves in, so to speak. Yeah.
That's phenomenal. And, you know, the focus on fear. I think it gets back to our intro and preparation that Dr. Burnett Ziegler set up for us, and that fear can become a stressor, and it causes you to make all kinds of decisions. So if you're in the minority, that fear is probably playing in the majority.
Absolutely.
It causes all kinds of reactions. It's keeping that in place. Chris, you look like you got something.
I guess. Well, you know, we know that stress, as Dr. Ingrid was just talking about, influences and creates a filter by which we approach and engage not only with ourselves and our belief in self, kind of that self-efficacy, and to what Emmy was just talking about, that fear is not just of what's happening to you, but how are you able to sustain and thrive inside of these organizations. And so the trauma of it all, right, is what I think we're all trying to figure out how to navigate through. And if you go back just 3 summers ago, almost 3 summers ago with George Floyd, that collective trauma that we all experienced together, and how that is starting to manifest itself with increased numbers of individuals showing mental health issues and challenges. And that is exponential in our community. And so imagine how that shows up in the workplace and how we're able to continue to provide and thrive and perform in life. So to that point, I just kind of saw that nice little connection of what the two of you just said.
I certainly appreciate the introduction of fear into this conversation, and I think fear is pervasive among Black people in the workplace. Fear of not being enough, fear of doing the wrong thing, saying the wrong thing, fear of being misunderstood, fear of being mischaracterized. And, you know, the people that I work with can get so caught up in the thoughts and that cycle of fear that they can't think about anything else. I hear people talk about being in meetings and they're in their heads thinking, wondering, what do people think of me? Did I say the right thing? Did I use the right words? Did I use the right tone of voice? How is my body language and my presentation being assessed in this particular situation? And when you're so caught up in performing in the right way, it's hard, as Dee was talking about so beautifully in the documentary, to bring your fullest, most real, perhaps also most powerful self, because you're trying to perform in accordance with what you believe the environment expects of you.
Yeah.
And if I may just sort of go with what you're saying, Dr. Burnett, that fear is very, very real. And I can remember many years ago trying to very much stifle what I was wanting to do and become in the corporate sector. And it was almost like, just how do I not rock the boat? Going through this journey and, you know, dealing with microaggressions and wanting to climb and wanting to perform and excel in this space, but not rock the boat. So I definitely would have been one of those people, Dr. Burnett, who was in my head about, where's my body language? I'm upset, but how do I not show it? What are my eyes doing? Because I'm very self-aware of, you know, how I look and how that can be perceived as being angry. So I do thank you for validating what we experience in the workplace as Black people when it comes to fear, and how we express it or don't express it for that matter.
One more question about the fear piece, and then I promise to turn over to you. If Black people in the workplace are experiencing fear, if the minority, right, is experiencing fear, is the majority experiencing fear? If so, how? Why?
I'd love to jump on that. Absolutely. Yeah. Without a doubt. You know, the why question is very difficult. I think maybe someone in those shoes will be a little bit more eloquent than I would about why. But I could share experiences where I've, you know, talked to and work with executives who might be part of the majority community or majority representation within the workplace. And the fear is really around the climate we're in now, where saying the wrong thing could be very detrimental to your entire career, and even beyond that. And you know, and some examples of this was very prevalent during the Me Too era. And you know, I remember, you know, in that, and we talk about the Me Too era, where it's more about gender and acknowledging our non-binary folks, but I'm speaking with the example of male and female here. I remember that period where, you know, even amongst my conversation, being on the side of, I guess, men, being very cautious around how we interacted with women and as your colleagues. You could really want to, for example, there were conversations around how come, as an executive, you only take the guys to lunch? You only play golf with the guys. Well, in the back of my head is I want to be very careful that I don't put myself in a predicament where it could be misconstrued or have the wrong perception of, or I say the wrong thing. And so if I'm experiencing that through the lens of gender, I can only imagine what some other who might be a non-minority might feel if they maybe don't get a joke or say the wrong joke or get too comfortable and say the wrong thing. And that could be really devastating for them. But like I mentioned during the documentary, I think that in itself is a privilege, a choice you get to have not to participate. And for some people that are in the minority, you don't always have that choice. You are presented in a certain way, and many times than not, you are leading with fear, like Will explained. But I do think that fear is prevalent across the entire culture of the workplace, considering the climate we're in now.
And we see it in the space that I work in organizational research. Many of you probably heard the concept psychological safety, right? That has come on stage fairly quick and fast here in the last 3 years, and it is getting at how safe people feel to be able to show up. And that is not just for Black folks. Pervasively, we're seeing psychological safety be an issue across the board. So that lets us know that organizations, I'm not going to say all, but a large number of them are what you hear the word toxic, not just for Black folks, but for just about everybody that's in there.
I wonder if we can get anything done.
I often come across so many young professionals who are just so fearless. And the young people in general, they're fearless and they don't care about rocking the boat. Do you think they have an understanding of this hierarchy, even though we cannot see it?
Oh, Tawana, good question. You know what? I've got a bunch of Gen X's and millennials and Gen Zers on my team. They see it, and they see the need for change, and they're pushing for it. I'm challenged every day in a good way to kind of evolve my thinking of how to lead this group of folks. And so I'm happy to be pushed, but not everybody out there wants to be pushed. And that was one of the things I wanted to talk about. There's a significant amount of change happening in our world. And most folks are looking for that stasis, that, hey, where can I find my balance? And there's just a lot going on, which is adding to the fear, adds to the stress, adds to the toxicity that we see in organizations. But what I'm hopeful is to see these younger folks actually challenging the system to be better, to do better.
Love that.
But there's a degree of vulnerability that also exists there, right? As Chris, I've got a number of younger individuals on the team. Nope, they don't have a problem challenging, right? Which is good, which is really good.
Right.
But there are moments in which they're challenging that I'm not sure if they're challenging bringing their full, authentic selves, right? So there's a narrative that they've been given, and they're doubling down on the narrative without having full context. So at the end of the day, yes, I think they are. It's needed, but there is some degree of vulnerability that I'm hearing expressed around that as well.
Anyone else want to chime in on that?
Yeah, I love that you're bringing in vulnerability. I think the younger generation is more open to being vulnerable and expressing what they want, what they expect, getting their needs met, whether it's needs around safety, inclusion, mentorship, sponsorship, and doing so boldly in a way that is less committed to structures that generations before have been, challenging expectations around respectability politics, challenging expectations around, how they should show up physically, and coming back to this idea of how they should present in certain spaces. And there may be a different type of vulnerability that comes with that when generations clash, if you will. But I think there's certainly something to be learned and gained from how younger generations are just so proud and bold in terms of how they show up and what they ask for. In my work, two examples I like to refer to, thinking about mental health in the workspace, are Naomi Osaka and Simone Biles. And what I think is the beautiful example that they set up in, prestigious, on the world stage examples of their work, saying, I can't do this right now, and this is why. I'm suffering, I have these needs, and these are the boundaries that I have to set in order to be able to take care of myself. And I think that there's something that all of us can learn from that in our respective workplaces, in terms of knowing our own needs and being able to ask for what we need from our workplace in order to better take care of ourselves.
And I also feel like there's something great about the younger generation that comes in, expressing their vulnerability and challenging certain systems in the workplace, because as a leader, that allows me to also be vulnerable with them, to say, I hear you and what you're saying, and let me help you understand that I don't know it all, or understand the journey that I've had, because therein creates an understanding from one generation to another that says, thank you, I appreciate that you see me, because sometimes that can not necessarily quiet the challenge, but create sort of a level playing field between one generation and another, when you can sort of, as a leader, again, say, we're on the same plane.
Yeah, and I'm certainly not picking on the younger generation. But Darryl, you talked about there is a pushback, and there is a need for vulnerability. We've been talking about rights, civil rights, since the 60s. And for some of us, that's in our lifetime. I know it is in mine, right? So it's not like this is an old conversation. Is there a need to revisit how we got here? So as the pushback happens, right, what's the context by which that pushback is finding its root? And as we think about moving forward, what do you need to do differently, right? Because it was said a few times, in the documentary, if we don't know our history, right? If we don't know the history, it is bound to repeat itself, i.e., we'll stay marginalized. So what is it that you think what perspective does this multi-generational workforce need to have if we are to successfully sort of lean in, push back, whatever metaphor works for you?
Melissa, I think that's such a great question, and I don't have the answer. But what I would like to do is I'd like to take that same question and reframe that question in a workplace setting, if I may.
Absolutely.
And keep it a question.
Absolutely.
There's this theory I like to share often that talks about workplace culture and how culture is formed in any community. And so I'll tell you a story about the 5 wet monkeys, and maybe you've heard it. All right, and I'll try to keep it as quickly as possible. 5 wet monkeys in a science lab. There were scientists had these monkeys in the cage, 5 of them. They tied a string to a banana, dropped it down the top of the cage. The monkeys instinctively jumped and grabbed the banana. The scientists took a fire hose and sprayed water on the monkeys. We repeated this exercise until the monkeys learned not to grab that banana when it comes down the cage. The scientists then took the fire hose, put it away, and store it somewhere, never to be brought out ever again. They then went to a different country and imported a new monkey in. They took one of the veteran monkeys, or the monkeys that had been there a while, out, with a new monkey, and now there are 4 veteran monkeys and 1 new monkey, and they brought down the banana on the string. What happened? The new monkey instinctively dashed and went to the banana. What was interesting was the 4 other monkeys jumped the new monkey to restrain the monkey from grabbing the banana. They repeated this exercise over and over again until all 5 older monkeys were replaced with newer monkeys. And they kept this process going until there were over 5, 10, 15, 20, 40, and on changes of monkeys. And realized at a certain point, none of the monkeys went for the banana on the string. However, none of the monkeys currently in the cage ever saw the fire hose. So when you think about what you just talked about, is if we don't do a good job explaining how we got here, what's happened is that we have formed behaviors to adapt and survive. That the generations, all they see is the behaviors we are depicting, not understanding where it's coming from, and it's passed through generations. So the lack of that education and reality is a tremendous gap in almost fixing or addressing the issue. So like I said, it's still a question. But I just thought it was interesting to kind of pull that back
Absolutely.
into the workplace and how it truly impacts culture.
No, that was a great example for what we're talking about, because if you don't know why some things are in place, it just is, right? And I think the various generations are finding that line of demarcation, right? And still get labeled, still get stigmatized, still get marginalized in some cases, but understanding some of that history can help certainly inform what our future approach needs to be.
Well, that's a lot to unpack.
Yeah.
In the workplace, or not necessarily the workplace, but many people want us to stop talking about race. But why does it matter? Simple question.
How much time do we have?
Well, there are 2 parts to this.
I can jump in. I think it matters, particularly when we're talking about DEI and perhaps people who are Black working in majority white spaces, for our peers and our colleagues to have a broader understanding of who the people are that they're sharing space with. Everybody that we work with are bringing to their workplace a full set of lived experiences, family experiences, identity, culture, and that all informs how they show up, the work that they do, the lens through which they see the world. And as your colleague, you might just see, Inger showing up to work and not understanding all of these layers that I bring with me that inform the work that I do, the way that I think, the comments that I make, the days that I'm stressed, the news that I heard coming in that has me in a different temperament on one particular day, the thing that the person said in the meeting that is triggering me and I'm having a reaction for the rest of that day. Our colleagues that have different lived experiences that are not necessarily having these conversations about race and racism and discrimination and microaggressions in the workplace don't have even a glimpse of that understanding. And so, these conversations I think are important for everybody. It's not just the Black people in the workplace, but our colleagues who hopefully want to be better allies, supporters, just community members that create a healthier culture for everyone.
And I'll add that some may feel like if you ignore the problem, it will go away. And that's not always the case. And as you sort of heard what I had to say in the documentary, my foot is on the gas full throttle because we have to have these conversations. It's so very important to continue to talk about this in these spaces so that we don't lose our history. If we consider almost 3 years ago when, the world recognized the George Floyd murder and everything that happened after that, and consider where we are today, it's a bit more quiet because we're not talking about the problem as much. There are practitioners like myself and others who are still committed to doing the work, but there are some that are really happy that we are not talking about this as much. So not saying that we need to continue to have this uprising, but our voices need to be as solid and sound as they were almost 3 years ago. And so how do we keep that same momentum going in a space where it doesn't have to look like, things are being burned down and there's this chaos, but in a way that still is fueling to what people want us to be quiet about.
Absolutely. Yemi, you talked about in Nigeria, everybody's black, using your phrase, but there were hundreds of ethnicities. All of that was taken away from us when we, had that unfortunate journey that has literally continued to inform where we are today, right? We don't have race and ethnicity. We just know black, unless you were fortunate enough to come here with the ethnicity of another land with you. Most of us, millions of us, did not have that opportunity, right? So what then needs to change? We need to have these conversations. How do we move through this respect for, I am a multidimensional, layered individual, and guess what? So are you. Respect the black, because quite frankly, you strip me of everything else.
If I may, and I want to hold space to have a pointy point of view on this. We learn often there's a time and place. I'm not sure if, this is my home, they always tell us there's a time and place for everything. And with this topic, I think the time is not only now, it's been the time. But the question that I have is the place. It's the place. And so you make a very good point. So what we saw after the unfortunate murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and many others, was the civil unrest that followed, and the strong voice from corporations speaking up to say, hey, we're going to do better. And sometimes I think deeply to say, is that the space? Is that the right space to truly make this difference? I'm not saying it's not the space. What's the workplace? It's a business. And typically, they have business things to do. And I think it's absolutely correct that they are attempting to step up, and we hold workplaces accountable without a doubt. So this is not a matter of it shouldn't. This is a matter of, but where is that space? And when we think about places where we learn, it's academic institutions. That space is for learning. It's for learning. And the vast majority of people in the corporations typically go through that space. Yet, when we look at the curriculums across all the way from elementary through higher institutions, higher education, you don't see required courses for courses on race relations. It's an elective. Even DI courses are electives. There should be an uproar about that. It should be a requirement that every leader in business schools, that you take leadership courses, you must take an inclusion leadership course. Right? So my point is, I'm just not hearing enough of accountability put on academic institutions just as much as workplaces. And this is not saying take the foot off the pedal for workplaces. This is saying put the pedal to the metal on academic institutions. Yeah. It's a place for learning. Darn it. Let's learn.
Yeah. There's also a movement to stop people from learning.
Yes.
So there's a lot to unpack there.
says a lot.
Can I add
They're
something?
saying we've got to go to break.
We have to go to break.
We've got to wrap up this portion. But there is definitely a lot to unpack there. And we're going to get ready to get some reactions from the audience. And certainly you'll have an opportunity to weigh in on some things as well. But before we do that, let me call on a very special guest that's in our audience to provide some additional reflection. That's Monique Jones, President and CEO of Forefront. Monique?
Good afternoon, good evening. Thank you. This is very, very inspiring conversation and challenging conversation. And so if art mimics real life, this is it in documentary form. But just launching off of that, thinking about being a leader in this nonprofit sector and the precious human capital that I oversee day to day, I'm left wondering where I fit in the trajectory of change. What legacy am I leaving? What legacy are we all leaving in this space? And working hard, grinding, keeping your head down when you should, only to reap the benefits of lower wages and inequitable access, more health disparities, shorter lifespan. This isn't new. This isn't new. So, but speaking of the younger generations, I'm left wondering how my role will help my preteen and her peers, your children, your grandchildren, not be standing here in the next 15 years having this same conversation, watching this documentary, watching us, saying what did our parents and grandparents not do to make this. So I'm interested in what appetite we have for true policy change and things that really address and reverse what we've been through, what we've all been talking about here, caste systems, reparations. What's the appetite for those true things? What's our appetite for practices that really speak to eliminating all the things that we were set up to believe were right? The spaces that we need to continue to learn in with our white counterparts. The spaces that need to be changed are governance, policies, values, strategic plans that we all set up every day. So we live in a society built on systems that were designed to exploit and eradicate Black folks. What are we going to do to make sure the next generation does not have to deal with it? And that's the heavy lift, the absolute heavy lift, and we don't have generations to change it. So it's not something that we want to think about beyond the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years to when we're walking our grandchildren around. So I see in this room leaders. Thank you for being great leaders of influence and power and change makers. And I'm hoping that we can partner together to make all these changes. I mean, I can't remove myself, as we said, and I can't remove myself from the arena of fear. But standing in this fear, how do we work together to make the change so that we're not hearing again in another 15 years? Thank you for that.
Thank you, Monique. Let's see what other members of our audience have on their minds, hearts, and spirits. Raise your hand if you have a question so that I can get a mic to you.
While we're getting the mic, Daryl, you want to go ahead and give your comment? And we'll get over there.
Briefly, as we were talking here on the panel, something came to my frontal lobe. You know, we've been doing this work for a long time, right? This is not new. Right. And in the course of doing this work, what I have observed, primarily in corporate, is the work has benefited some populations within these corporate cultures, specifically. As it was originally intended to support Black and brown individuals navigating these organizations, it defaulted to supporting other dimensions of diversity within these corporate confines, right? Women, specifically, right? Majority women, specifically. So if you look in organizations now, you look across, you look up, what do we see more of, right?
White women.
White women. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. But as the organizations have applied a rigor, right, and an intentionality around that. The question becomes, when will that intentionality and that rigor be placed in supporting brown and black people achieve the same? Because if we're looking at these organizations right now, the revolving door, it's not women. It's brown and black people. I just wanted to put that out there.
That's true. That's true. Tawana?
Thank you. I just want to say thank you to the panel. I've been very much invigorated by everything that's been said, but I wanted to make a comment and then ultimately have a question. So you talked a lot about George Floyd and all of the, kind of the protest and all the spotlight on the topic that we're talking about. There was also a lot of money that was came from the corporations and the federal government, state government, a lot of money put at trying to kind of level the playing field. And so just as we just talked about, where is the right place to talk about it? I love the concept, put the foot on the metal. I think I'm always going to remember that now as I talk about this topic, but I think it was a very good idea when we think about where we should be having this conversation and where we can start this movement. Certainly higher education and our school systems are a good place. But if we look back historically, a lot of the movements that have happened have, one, been people 30 and under, and two, it's kind of been this grassroots movement that has helped kind of push different agendas. So my question is, where can we start some of this educational kind of grassroots? Because certainly in the workplace, particularly if you talk about corporate America and some of the larger organizations, you just don't have that opportunity to really be as vocal and really start. So that would be my question. Where can we start a more aggressive kind of grassroots with the younger people, some of us older people, et cetera?
I think that's a great question, and I'm going to direct it to you, Chris, because in the documentary, you talk about performative actions.
Right.
So I think in the context of what can we do and how can we educate, I think it's important to really differentiate between these performative commitments, i.e. all this money,
Right.
and what are some actualized commitments. What's the difference?
Got it.
How do you get there?
Yeah, so performative is I want to show you that I'm doing good, that I have intention of impact. And so there was a lot of money. But what was not attached to that money that got distributed was any accountability to actually show, hey, our progress, we intend this, we're going to attend to this, and we're going to achieve that. I think if you go back and look over the last 3 years, a lot of those companies who made statements are now trying to figure out how to hide any progress or any action that they took because they did not achieve what they said they were going to go do. And so there's a bunch of performative action. But a lot of that has to do with fear. And I'm going to go back to the fear conversation. A lot of leaders who sit at the top of these organizations are just as fearful as everybody else to keep the very job that they have. And I think about the story you told about your colleague. Who don't want to take that risk. And if you put yourself out there, there's a likelihood, how am I going to be able to sustain my livelihood? And so they're not going to take that risk. So you're going to get a lot of performative, what I call kabuki theater. Look over here, versus actually doing the work around that. I'll tie back to Daryl's point, Melissa, I'm going to bring this in, is around when you see organizations make a commitment, you will see the visible impact of that commitment. I think about there was a stat in there talking about a lot of people of color who are in leadership positions, management position, or on those in hospitality, restaurants, healthcare. You also can see, I worked for a very large hotel company. You can look me up and see who that is. But one of the things I can say about that particular hotel company, not only did they promote women and people of color into management, but they were also doing that in business development with franchise owners and suppliers. And so you can actually see the impact of those organizations. You hear me talk about good, better, best. Those best organizations are out there with demonstrated, provable, evidence-based outcomes of what they're doing, not just the kind of the womp, 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 womp. If you're a Charlie Brown fan, you know what I'm talking about. But you know what I mean, of the kabuki theater. That was a whole lot of analogies in there, so work with it.
We got it. It's good. Darren?
But she asked a question. There was a question, and it was, what can we do? It's grassroots. And it starts with, I believe, community. We have to become, and I'm going to use this word a lot, more intentional about ensuring that, one, our younger generation, I'm a boomer, right? They have insight into the history, right? How are we supporting, surrounding, right? Feeding into them, right? But then two, how are we positioning them, right? With that word, again, intentionally, to show up in this highly polarized space, environment that we're living in right now, right? Manage the fear, right? Lean into the vulnerability. Realize collectively, right, there's more power, and leverage that to create the voice, those grassroots initiatives that galvanize and begin to drive that change. I look at some of our historical leaders. To your point, it was a lot of grassroots efforts, right, that really began to create the change. So how are we going to support?
D.
And there are a lot of unsung organizations here in the city of Chicago that are really working with young people. And if you're working with young people, you're working with their families, talking about mental health. When we talk about there's so much crime and there's so much violence, and what is the solve for this? Look at the young people and offer them spaces. And there are tons of organizations that do that in Chicago. So when you talk about how do we start, there are places in the city, and I don't. If I named one, I'd have to name them all, and so I won't do that. But I've been to enough of these grand openings, visiting with CEOs and talking to frontline staff about their passion for this work, enough to know that there is intention. There's intentionality around creating true change in our city. I want to keep it local because I'm so local, but I'm a believer in true change.
Yeah. And if I may add to that, great question, by the way, thank you for asking. Buy Black. Buy people of color. Buy women-owned businesses. Often we talk about this conversation about marginalization, and we talk about the workplace. It's just one pillar. We have tremendous entrepreneurs doing great things. In fact, for those in human capital, you would know this, Daryl. The Great Resignation, they called it, a couple years ago, where we saw a lot of people quitting their jobs. A lot of these folks were people of color who were looking to go do their own businesses. Let's go support them. Right, because what happens is we support Black businesses, they grow, they need people to hire. They might hire just our people as well, right? So I think there's this multiple thing we can do, and so for me, I've become personally, I'm not even campaigning this, I've become more intentional about where I take my clothes to get dry clean, where I go, grab breakfast or brunch sometimes, and where it's just where I put my money. And I think a lot of people are doing this as well. And I think that is one way that we could be part of that progress to kind of, at the same time, close the wealth gap and create some economic prosperity within those communities.
And that's actual commitment. You could see that through line all the way through. So the entire ecosystem that an organization touches, what's the through line that's saying we're going to make sure this, that, and the other is diverse. We're going to make sure that everything we do is inclusive. And you're going to be able to see it in the bottom and the top line and in the workforce. That's when you know those commitments are beyond just talk. Tawana, is there another question in the audience?
One more question.
Hello, good evening. My name is Yusef Garcia. I have the pleasure to serve with Monique at Forefront. I really want to applaud this documentary because it taps on capitalism in a way that I haven't quite seen before. And I want to thank everyone who was part of it because I heard a lot of antitheticals, equity, psychological safety, and I can't help but think that those are all completely antithetical to this era of capitalism that we live in. So for y'all to be advocates and soldiers swimming upstream, I just really want to thank you all. My question is about getting to the how did we get here and history. In this era of erasure of indigenous history, where we've come from, the era of deep fakes and artificial intelligence, I'm curious, and we're here at CAN TV, a media organization. What if folks think about where do we get the history from? Where do we get accurate history, and where should folks go to get that understanding of how we got here?
Great question.
Really good one.
I think Daryl has an answer.
That is a great question. And where do people go?
Oh my God.
I'm sitting here and immediately I'm reflecting back my immediate family and the history that's contained within my family, right? Generational, right? How do we tap into that? That's one. Two, yeah, a lot of great educational systems, right, that provide learning. But beyond that, there are individuals within our communities that have amassed, treasure troves of historical facts that are not mainstream. How do we tap into that and begin to expand and socialize that more broadly? It's two. So those are the two that I'm thinking of.
Anyone else want to weigh in? Dr. Burnett Ziegler? Anything?
As I was listening to you talk, I was thinking about the history makers locally and the archives of stories over generations that is contained in there. And I think that speaks to what I think you were talking to about, kind of maintaining the legacy of knowledge that is outside of the kind of traditional academic sphere is an important part of getting that historical context as well.
I know we have to go, but we have one more question.
Actually, hello. I'm Darius Hill. I'm the executive director here at CAN TV. Let me just begin with thank you. One of your earlier questions, you were part of the answer, and that is having the fearlessness to stand in the space. I am sort of done with looking to others to save me. So it is great when others are under the tent and we create that space here. But each night when I pray, because I'm a man of deep faith, I thank the Father for covering confirmation. And I would encourage all of us to intentionally be that for each other. Case in point, Chris and I are on the call tomorrow with a colleague in another part of the country who is in this space doing work, and we need to make sure she doesn't feel alone. Because covering confirmation, it is much easier to make these quiet, sweeping changes of moving out the DEI leaders, those people in that room. So I have to ask myself every day, even here at CAN TV, which is, I would say, one of the safer spaces that does not make it free of microaggression, that does not make it free of all of the issues that we all deal with. So as we sit here and do this work, we're all living it. So I have to ask myself every day, at this point in my Black career, at 54 3/4, what am I willing to sacrifice? I know I'm going to keep saying it. I'm very proud of the 3/4. But honestly, what are you willing to sacrifice? Those of us who have a bit more of a luxury, I ask myself every day, in this dash moment, what am I willing to sacrifice for the greater good of us? Because it's so easy to kind of go, well, you know, I've got to stay here. I don't want to be the very thing that Yemi talked about, so I have to hold myself accountable. And I think that's what we need to do, hold each other accountable. But we are the answers we seek. Those are my thoughts.
I wholeheartedly agree.
All right, thank you.
Well, you know, and I think to get back to Yusef's question, there's more information available today than there ever was before.
Ever.
So if people really want to know, you can find it. The question is, are you looking at credible sources?
That.
Or are you just going along with the crowd? Are you using your gift of discernment to figure out, does this make sense? Does it make sense for me? You know, does it make sense for this? Is there anyone who may be Black but having a different experience? Because there are some dimensions they're bringing to the table that gives them a different perspective. They could be a Black person raised by white parents. You know, so we can't just take things on the surface and then take action or judge based on what we see on the surface. There's a lot more to it. Even people that we think are in the majority populations, sometimes there's some experiences that are shared. Sometimes some of us have had better experience than some of them. You know, it's really about perspective. Where is individually, your story is probably different than my story. How did we get to, you know, you mentioned the crime, Dee. How did we get there? They just didn't come out, you know, swinging. You know, there's a pathology, there's a history, there's a story. Like, look at it and see. And I love the fact that, Dee, you mentioned there's so many organizations around. There's a lot of institutions around designed to educate us all. We have to go buy Black, read Black. Like, if you really want to know, you can find it. There's no reason to be ignorant these days. No excuse.
No excuse.
Thank you. The conversations are not easy to have, but absolutely necessary if we are, as a community, a city, a state, and a country, going to find our way forward together, unlearning deeply rooted and long-held beliefs about race in this country.
And I couldn't agree more, Tawana. Thank you sincerely to our panelists and to our in-studio audience for the intentional act of creating a brave and safe space for a very difficult conversation and listening to understand and not simply to disagree or to judge.
The work continues on our collective journey to achievement of that more perfect union.
Good night, Chicago and beyond, and be well.